I think it's important to stress that there's not just one critical pedagogy. I like to say that there are many critical pedagogies. So the term really needs to be used in the plural. There are critical pedagogies and not one unitary pedagogy, although there are commonalities among all of them. For instance, there's feminist pedagogy. There is what I would call left liberal pedagogy, liberal pedagogy. There would be Marxist-driven pedagogy, pedagogy driven by Marxist humanism, which is the critical pedagogy I've tried to help develop. I have adopted a particular approach to critical pedagogy, which is greatly indebted to people like Paula Ullman, who was an adult educator working in England. And I've adopted an approach based on her work, the work of Glenn Rakowski, also the Marxist humanist philosophy of Peter Hudis, Raya Dunayevskaya. And I've tried to forge an approach to pedagogy that I would call a philosophy of praxis. Now, pedagogy encompasses all kinds of things. Most people associate it with classroom teaching. So when you talk about critical pedagogy, teachers want to know what's the best way to organize my classroom, how do I organize my curriculum, what are teaching methods that are available that can make subject matter more interesting, more engaging. That's really not my focus, although I think it's important. Early on in my life, I was a classroom teacher. I taught grades 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And that was my focus, to how do you work with students in urban contexts, new immigrants that speak languages other than English, and English is not their first language. These were issues that really engaged me at the time, and they still do to a certain extent. But what do you do with students who are disabled and need specialized specialized teachers who can help them? These are all, what do you do about English, and issues around bilingual education, issues around testing, standardized testing. These are areas that I worked on substantively when I was starting out in the field. But over the years, my work has become much more macro, and I've been focused more on social relations in capitalist societies. And capital is a social relation, right? And in the United States, in teacher education programs or in graduate programs in education, PhD, master's level programs, nobody really addressed the issue of capitalism. And it struck me as being very strange because we live in a capitalist society. And it was just assumed that it was going to be there, it is there, and there's no alternative, so why even discuss it? But capitalism, for instance, creates barriers to school reform. And in my mind, in a capitalist society, you only have a little bit of what some people call wiggle room, right? You only have this little kind of arena where you can try to make some policy changes, you can make some changes vis-a-vis curriculum, you know, what you call here that are reforma, you know, and that's always focused on just that little kind of slice, and and that's the whole world for educators. And I wanted to open that world up and say, what would education be like in a non-capitalist society, and how can we begin those kinds of discussions as part of education, educational studies in general. So I just thought, well, how can education play a part? And so now you have to understand, I'm in the Estados Unidos. So what you might take for granted here is very different in the US. So just talking about capitalism, talking about ways of organizing our social and material life differently, so that we can save the planet. Now, some of my students who were not that familiar with the Marxist critique, which came primarily from Europe, but also from people like Jose, right? Like Mariátegui, right? They were very much interested in the eco-socialism, the ecology movement, and they tried to sort of bring some of the Marxist critique and some of the, you know, the ecology movements together. And I remember I was asked to go and give a talk to, I forget where it was. It was somewhere in Arizona. Forget the name of the school, but it was they were focused on ecology, but they wanted a Marxist voice to be present, because they were really the ecology movement failed to sufficiently address capitalism. Around 1985, the year that I left Canada to go and work with Henry Giroux in Miami University of Ohio, that year I was very excited to work with Henry. And we developed the first cultural studies and education center at the time in the United States, in education, not cultural studies, but cultural studies in education. And we talked a lot about creating a critical pedagogy of critical citizenship. And that was going to be our focus, basically, you know, the notion of how can education produce critical citizens? And I began to realize that when you look at all the federal initiatives, federal policies, we have No Child Left Behind. Obama came in with Race to the Top. Instead of helping poor, underfunded schools, he proposes to reward those schools that are doing well. And so he's pushing, you know, the logic of privatization. So you've got these federal initiatives, you've got state initiatives, and they're all absolutely intertwined with the production of consumer citizenship. And how in that products will define your life, you know, that we live in a world of commodity production, the stress on privatization of education, meant that, talk to professors. They would say, students now are saying, we pay your salaries, we want to meet with you Monday, Wednesday, Friday at these times. And there was this sort of shift so that, teachers became sort of, I guess, there was a client relationship between teachers and students. It was almost like a business transaction. And universities were getting involved in a lot of military funding, surveillance. There was, take the case of California. California has the largest, it's basically a prison economy. United States is becoming a security state. The police are becoming militarized. The black population and the Latino population go almost directly to prison. Especially the African American population almost go directly to prison. It's called the school-to-prison pipeline. The prisons are becoming privatized to the extent that some governors, mayors, have promised the private prisons that they will change the law to turn a misdemeanor into a felony, and they will say, we will guarantee your prison will be full if you come and build your prison in our community because we need the business. And the universities, wanted, in the California Department of Corrections, where it was given all kinds of money, and the universities wanted a part of that money. Instead of protesting this, the universities by and large cooperated. So I'm having all these conversations. I'm doing it in the sphere of education, and all I can say is that we need to emotionally, affectively invest in an alternative, and it's not there. It's really not there. It hasn't been developed. People have to. Gramsci talked about a war of position and a war of maneuver. We need to be able to invest in an alternative and say, well, you know what? That's a reasonable plan. That might work. We should really, put a lot of our energy in that direction. And if we're going to be educators and we want to change the world, right? We want to change the world. We want to do it from an ethical position. And for me, it's being Catholic, right? Part of it is my own Catholic sensibility of having an obligation to struggle against unnecessary pain and suffering. We have the ability to do that now technologically, right? We have the technology in place. So if you say something nice about capitalism, we could say that it's given us the technology to feed the planet, to provide for some minimal, at least, sense of dignity in terms of putting a roof over your head and medical attention. We can at least address most of the major treatable diseases. We can do that. Now, people like Paul Mason in England, and everyone's talking about Paul Mason, argue that the technology that we have now will enable us to move into post-capitalist society through the technology, right? That we're going to require fewer workers, and all we need to do is be creative. We've got the technology to move us into a post-capitalist world. I'm a little bit cynical about that. The work of Bill Robinson, I think, is very important. He writes about the transnational capitalist class and the creation of the transnational state. He's at University of California, Santa Barbara. Kevin Anderson works of the Marxist Humanist Organization. They work in the same department. I began reading a lot of Bill's work and his connection between transnational capitalism and polyarchy, right? Very important connections there. So I just, you know, I'm trying to bring these conversations into education where they don't exist. I don't see, I mean, I don't think I'm necessarily bringing anything new. I'm not a pioneer in economics or sociology, but I'm trying to appropriate these arguments and concerns and bring them into the sphere of education and into the sphere of critical pedagogy. So what I'd like to do is create a social movement. Critical pedagogy needs to become transnational, and we need to build alliances because any attempt, I think, to create an alternative to capitalism has to be transnational in scope.